Welcome to Miamisburg Historical Society's biennial series, and it's appropriate that we have these starting the biennial because in 4 years the city of Miamisburg will be celebrating its bicentennial. So we are happy that we are here, and I am Carol O'Connell with the Historic Society, and we are the first to be kicking the biennial series off, and we're very fortunate to have the expert on the Miami Canal, Miami-Erie Canal, and that is David Neuhardt, who has done extensive research on the canal. So any question you might have, you just ask David. But David is currently the president of the Yellow Springs
Historical Society.
Right, and then he is also, when he's not doing research on Ohio, he does have a job, and he is a corporate lawyer. So my first question to you, David, is why do we have a canal, and where was it?
Carol, we'll take a look at a map here in a minute that will show us the route of the Miami-Erie Canal. And when Ohio was just emerging from the wilderness in the 18-teens and 1820s, it was a tremendous place with lots of agricultural output, but no place to sell all those goods. And it was expensive to try to take it to where the demand was, which was east of the mountains, by wagon or by pack horse. So the state came up with this idea, following the example of New York with the Erie Canal, which was tremendously successful in connecting the Hudson River with Lake Erie, to build a canal. And that canal started in two different places. There was a canal first from Portsmouth to Lake Erie at what became Cleveland, and our own Miami Canal, Miami-Erie Canal. Originally just went from Cincinnati to Dayton, and it was really put in place in part because this was a major population center, relatively speaking, for the state, and they wanted votes, and so they needed to get votes. But the area that it covered was a very good agricultural area too. Eventually, by 1845, the canal was extended all the way to Lake Erie at Toledo.
Well, the canal, excuse me, the canal was pretty well washed out, though, with the 1913 flood, wasn't it?
That brought an end to it, and it had been going downhill for a number of years. The 1913 flood just took what was left and put it pretty much out of commission.
Well, we have some statistics on that, just on our one slide that's coming up, that shows exactly what the mileage and the different things that were along the way.
Sure, and originally the original Miami Canal, which was just that short section between Cincinnati and Dayton, it ran through the cities. It actually created the cities in a lot of ways between Cincinnati and Dayton. Lockland, right where I-75 is today, Hamilton, Middletown, coming up the Miami Valley to Franklin, Miamisburg, and then ending at Dayton. And that was 66 miles long, but in order to build the canal that long, it took all these structures that are listed on the screen, 32 locks, because the canal had to raise. Dayton was 297 feet higher than Cincinnati, so the canal and the boats that are using the canal actually had to be raised almost 300 feet to get to Dayton. 6 aqueducts. We'll probably talk about some aqueducts later on. It was a way of getting the canal over streams, as were stone culverts, 27 culverts. And it was completed to Dayton in December of 1828. The first through boats really were early the following year.
And well, when it cost $900,000, what would that be in today's dollars?
Millions of dollars. For an example, the state just finished rebuilding one lock, and we had all those locks in that section, but one lock in Lockington this spring at a cost of $2.3 million.
Oh,
so that gives you an idea,
yes.
Yeah, right, what it is by comparison.
Oh my goodness. We have some statistics on slide 2. Let's see if we can see what people will always ask you, well, how many hours did it take to...
And this is the great thing about the canal, because once you could get on this smooth, easy travel, what was considered fast travel, because it moved at 3 miles an hour. There was a speed limit of 4 miles an hour, but the average speed was about 3 miles an hour, which meant you can get from Dayton to Cincinnati in a mere 20 hours. If you've been in some of the northern Cincinnati traffic, it can take that long.
It might be worth
75, it can take that long today. And to New York City, which was important because that's where the big markets were, it could take 20 days to make that 1,100-mile trip, which was considered miraculous speed. And the way you did it from Dayton or Miamisburg would be to take the canal, Miami Canal, down to Cincinnati, take a riverboat to Portsmouth, take that other canal, the Ohio and Erie Canal, all the way from Portsmouth to Cleveland on Lake Erie, a lake steamer from Lake Erie, or from Cleveland across Lake Erie to Buffalo, where you'd go into the Erie Canal, across the Erie Canal to Albany, and down the Hudson River by steamboat to New York. So it was a major trip, but it, as was shown on that screen, it made a huge difference in the ability to ship products and get the much greater prices that were available on the East Coast. And the freight rates went down from, say, $100 or more a ton by wagon to a mere $17 a ton. So it was profitable to ship the crops, and it brought in passengers too. 7,000 passengers by 1831 a year were coming from Cincinnati to Dayton, and you can just see here the statistics of the produce that were shipped out of this area. Flour, whiskey, bacon, and pork, huge amounts of pork. In fact, there's a famous story when the completion of the canal was being celebrated in Montgomery County in 1828. There was a dinner party at a tavern in Dayton, and one of the toasts that were made at that point were to the ladies of Dayton, the only produce of the Miami Valley we don't wish to see exported.
Well, that's nice. Some of us are still sticking around.
So they were thinking even almost 200 years ago about the exports from this area, and it continues to be true today.
Well, as you said, though, that it did bring profits into the area, and I know here in Miamisburg we did, because that was really when tobacco was king in the area. So a lot of that was
shipping a lot of tobacco, right. Tobacco and flour and
we had many mills, didn't we?
Right. And in fact, we'll talk about locks in a minute, but the power that was created by the fall of water at those locks could be used for mills and run millstones. And this section of the canal was at one point described as being 60 mills and 60 miles because it was such a productive area.
Yes. Particularly paper mills along the
paper
way.
mills,
yes.
A lot of the locks, that's right. That's right.
Well, we're talking about the canal boats. There were two types, weren't there? There was the packet and the passenger, but the packet carried all the goods and everything?
Well, the packet boat was really the passenger boat. That was what was generally the passengers would ride on. The freight boats, and there were two kinds of boats. One was called a line boat, and it would have a roof all the way along the cabin. These things were about 90 feet, 85 feet long.
Like that
you
one.
see the picture that's showing on the screen now. That's a line boat. It originally got that name. I mean, you can think of it as being looking like a line, but because passenger lines or freight lines used it. Now this is the next view is a three cabin boat. And the three cabin boats were not so much to carry passengers, but freight. And those spaces between the cabins were where the freight was carried. The rear cabin was typically where the captain and his family would live. Can you imagine living in that little space? The middle cabin was so you could carry your mules with you to pull the boat. That was a major innovation. Originally they tried to station the mules at different spots along the line, so when they had to change them, they had to be in the right place, but then they got smart and started carrying their mules with them. And then the front cabin was where the rest of the crew would stay.
Well, it was very innovative, though, for that period.
It was very innovative, and again, it was fast, and by comparison to a stagecoach on unimproved roads or a freight wagon on unimproved roads, it was a great improvement.
Well, they couldn't speed either, because you said 4 miles.
4 miles was there was actually
couldn't have a wake, could they?
there was a rule that said no more than 4 miles, and you're exactly right. It was because the wake would wash away the bank, and so they wanted to protect the bank, so they were I don't know if they ever got out there with a speedometer and tried to measure the mule's speed, but they wanted to keep the wake down to protect the banks.
Well, we do have the next one here, which we'll bring up, are the locks, which were so critical.
They were, and just to explain, as I mentioned before, when we looked at that introduction slide, it was 300 feet higher in Dayton than it was in Cincinnati. So this is, we'll take a look at this, how a lock worked, but if you think about it, the boat had to move uphill, and if you just had if you just had a canal that was at an angle, all the water would run out, obviously. So you had to be able to move the boat uphill, and it was by this simple mechanism of a lock, which goes back to Roman times. And it's a box, and it's a box with two gates, a gate on either end, and water at a higher level at the upper end and a lower level at the lower end. And so this might have been intended to raise the boat, depending on where it was located, 6 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet, something in that vicinity. And the way it worked, we take a look at slide A here, and you'll see the boat coming in. The gates work like dams. So the bottom gate is closed, holding the water at the higher level. The upper gates open, and the boat comes into the lock at that upper level. Then the upper gate closes, so you've sealed the boat into this box, and there are little, what were called wicket gates in the lower gates you could open and slowly let the water out. And so the upper gates are holding back the upper level, and the boat just really smoothly goes down, just like an elevator in water, I guess, and lowers it down. Then you can open the lower gates and go out. And so it was through that mechanism you could go uphill and downhill. Of course, you always had to have a water supply that was going to be higher than your highest lock, because you needed water to run downhill. This was not a mechanical system with pumps or anything. It was all operated with gravity.
Well, is that why there were so many lakes, like Indian Lake was created and St. Mary's Lake was created to feed into the canal? Exactly,
because in areas with a lot of water, like the Miami Valley, where they could tap the Great Miami River, they could dam the river and force water into the canal through that. It was easy enough, there was plenty of water. But as they got up higher and higher north of Dayton, up to the summit that divides the rivers that flow north into Lake Erie from the rivers that flow south into the Ohio River, there was less and less water supply available. So they had to create artificial water supply, and they did that by damming streams and creating reservoirs. Indian Lake, which was known as the Lewistown Reservoir originally, was built as a canal reservoir. Grand Lake St. Mary's, when it was built by hand in the 1840s to supply water to the Miami and Erie Canal, was the largest man-made lake in the world. And it could hold 2 years' supply of water for that section of the canal. Loramie Lake was the third reservoir that was built in that section. The summit level ran from Lockington, north of Piqua in Shelby County, to New Bremen, just south of St. Mary's. Mm-hmm. And that was the highest level of the entire canal. And then it started going down by means of locks into the Maumee Valley to go to Toledo.
About how many locks were along the canal there?
You know, I should know the number, but it was multiple hundreds. I don't know exactly what it was. Multiple hundreds of these stone boxes, basically, that had to be built. They were built. They'd first dig a hole and lay a timber frame or platform down which you don't see today, at least you hopefully don't see today, because as long as they stay buried, they've lasted 150, almost 200 years. So timber platform, and then the stone is laid on the timber platform to create the lock, and then the earth is brought back in, and
this shows there one of the locks.
This one, there were two locks here. You can see a lower lock and an upper lock, and those were just north of here in West Carrollton. And you can see just to the right of the locks, the paper mill that just recently has been
demolished.
Demolished,
yes.
but that's Dixie Highway running alongside the locks, and these are made of concrete. The state, sort of in an ill-fated effort to rebuild the canal system after the turn of the century, rebuilt a number of the locks in this area as in concrete. They tore out the stone locks.
So if this is running along the old 25 there, then when did it cross over, or did it just stay on that?
It crossed over about where the intersection of I-75 is with Dixie today, in West Carrollton, or just north of West Carrollton. There were actually, in Canal days, two different towns there. There was West Carrollton, sometimes just called Carrollton, and on the north edge, about where El Mason is, and the area where Woody's grocery store used to be, was known as Alexandersville.
Okay.
And that town, there was a road leading from Alexandersville to Bellbrook, and it was built primarily so that the southern Greene County would have a road to get their produce to the canal at the port of Alexandersville, and that's today's Alex Bell Road.
All right.
So,
well, we have the Sunfish lock down here. Now, is that where we have a picture of the gentleman and lady that were the lock? He was the lock keeper.
Yeah, and I think we'll see that in a second. The Sunfish, yeah, there they are. There they are. And there were, in most of these, at most of these locks, sometimes if they were too close together, there would only be one. There would be a lock tender's house built. And these were state employees. Often it wasn't enough pay to make it a full-time job, but they would have living arrangements. And then as the boats would come up to the lock tender could make sure, they sometimes refer to it as fitting the lock. So if the boat was on the lower end but the lock was full, they'd have to let the water out so that it was down at the boat level, and then open the gates, those big gates with the balance beams on them, and so the boat could pull in, and they'd snub the boat so it wasn't banging around, and then they'll let the water back into the lock and raise it up. And there were two locks that were considered Miamisburg locks. There was what was often called the Miamisburg lock, Lock 26, and these were numbered down from the summit level. So it was a 26th lock south of the summit that was right in town where the Pearl's Mill restaurant is, in the parking lot there. There's a lock street there, as a matter of fact.
There's a brewery there now.
Yeah, brewery there, microbrewery. Okay. Well, that's a good. The canalman would have loved that.
Yes.
Yeah. And then the other lock that was considered the Miamisburg lock, sometimes referred to as the lower Miamisburg lock, was Sunfish Lock, Lock 27, just about to the right along old. Dixie, yeah, only old 25, right about to the county line. Mm-hmm. And it's been now maybe 20 years ago, the early 1990s, that Miami Township refaced that lock. It had been in really bad shape, and they refaced it in concrete, and this is the sign for that rebuilt lock. And it was originally, 1990, I see on the photograph here. It was rebuilt in 1907 in concrete from the original stone, and there you can see at the gates, there's no gates in it, but this is exactly how it would look like. The further end is the end pointing towards Dayton or Miamisburg, and that's the higher end, and you can see it maybe in the picture, a drop-off, but if you go see it in person, and it's a nice little park, you'll see how the upper end was higher, and as you went towards Cincinnati, towards our spot here where we're looking, the canal or the lock would lower you down to the lower level. I think we have a photograph of the lock tender's house here too. An old photograph maybe.
The Sunfish Lock, yeah.
Yeah, it's now this is a different lock. This is the lock that was just north of West Carrollton, and that's Dryden Mill in the background where the Dryden Road got its name. And that's there we go. There we are. That's that shows the lock in the foreground, so you can see the chamber of the lock with the gate balance beams sticking out, and those were really heavy timbers that got thicker as they went out, so that there was a weight hanging at the end of them, and that helped to balance the lock gate and pull the nose of the lock gate up a little bit off the floor to make it a little easier to open and close the things. And then the house that's behind there is a lock tender's house. That, I believe, was eventually rebuilt, or not, maybe not rebuilt, but just a floor added onto it. And the last picture I've ever seen of it, it was right on the highway. It was a two-story view. And then you can see the Great Miami behind it.
Behind it, okay. Did they collect a fee then?
Yes, well, the lock tenders.
I mean, the lock tender.
The lock tender didn't collect a fee, but there was another office on the canal that was a state appointee called the collector, and the collector was based there was more distance between collectors. So the nearest collectors to Miamisburg would have been in Middletown or Dayton. There was a collector in both places, and they were responsible for collecting the toll, and at different times the tolls were different amounts. And I know reading in the 1850s the state was trying to promote Ohio salt, so they lowered the toll if it was salt from Ohio, but if it was someplace else you had to pay a higher toll on it. And these tolls were generally based on weight, although if there were passengers, the passengers would have to pay it, or the boat would pay for the passengers, a toll based on the mileage they covered. So you had a toll based on weight and the distance, and you had to report, if you were a captain, you had to report in to the collector, the nearest collector, and show your paperwork showing what you were carrying and where you were going and where you last paid the toll, so they would collect that toll and remit it to the state. There were great stories up in the Cleveland area when the canal was first built, that the collectors were getting a pretty good idea just by looking at the cargo how much it weighed, but some of these wily captains were sneaking things off the back and then sneaking it back on.
Nothing new, is
yeah,
it?
No. So there were people trying to cheat the system even back then. In fact, the state was so concerned about it that they ordered, in the 1850s, 4 Fairbanks Morse scales, gigantic scales that could weigh a canal boat, and they only built 2, actually installed 2 of them, one in Cleveland and one in Toledo, and it was a system where you'd bring the boat into what was like a chamber, like a lock, and the water was let out so that the boat was sitting on the scale, and they'd weigh the boat empty, and then they'd weigh it full, and so they could find out exactly what it was. And but not in other parts of the state. Those didn't really catch on.
Well, you know, it's always amazing, though, how they were able to get those boats to and from, and then when they had to pass another boat. And then they were, as you mentioned, the mules were the best ones to use for pulling them on the towpath. Yeah,
mules were smarter and hardier than horses generally, so they were the preferred animal to tow boats. And a mule is a cross between a horse and a donkey. And it was sort of a love-hate relationship with a lot of these boatmen and their mules. Here we're seeing a couple of teams.
Little girl there barefooted.
Yeah, now this photograph, I'm just going to impress you here by saying that's an eastern canal. Maybe the Chesapeake and Ohio, you can tell by the boat, but you can also tell by the horses, because in Ohio, the horses were generally harnessed in what's called tandem style. So one was in front of the other. It was less efficient, but, and there you can see the tandem style, because the towpaths, the area where they had to walk, was only 10 feet wide, and so it was narrower in Ohio than some of these other canals, and you had ones crossing, you only had enough room for single file mules. It wasn't quite as efficient, but if you imagine if you were the second mule, you spend all day looking at the tail end of the first mule.
Well, we have so much more to talk about. Would you be willing to do part 2 for this? Because,
sure.
Because we do have more to talk about, don't we?
I always enjoy talking about canals, so if you give me the opportunity, we can still talk.
That. We like that, and it's so historical, everything, and you have just collected so many wonderful things about it that are relative to us here in Miamisburg.
It was important to the history of Miamisburg.
Oh, heavens,
it
yes.
really was.
And with our bicentennial coming up, you know, that just brought the mid-1800s, and that brought in more people and more trade.
And that's right. And not only did it serve to transport goods made in Miamisburg to the rest of the world, it brought in raw materials in some cases that could be used here in the factories in Miamisburg. In the early days, any kind of bulk cargo was great for the canal because it was relatively cheap transportation, and so they could bring in iron or rags for paper mills, yes. Good raw material for paper. And also the canal was important to Miamisburg because it served as a major power source for mills in the area. And I don't know if we've got a few minutes we can talk about that now, or you want to try to...
Well, our time is running out. I don't know how much you can tell us about that.
Well, in the about the time of the Civil War, some businessmen in Miamisburg got together and decided to, if they could use some of that water in the canal to run their mills, drop it down through mill wheels, it would be a profitable enterprise. And we can talk more about it in part 2, but what they ended up doing was raising money. They built a dam across the Great Miami River at West Carrollton, called a hydraulic dam because it was intended to provide hydraulic power. And they built a small canal that ran from that dam into the main Miami Canal, which transported the water down from West Carrollton to Miamisburg, where it was used in the mills. And this in the foreground of this picture, you can see about the site of that original dam, but in the background is a modern low dam that replaced it.
I had the opportunity to visit that not too long ago, and people were fishing along this part of it right there in the front there.
Oh yeah, well, it definitely had a connection to Miamisburg, even though it was located in West Carrollton.
I know. Well, it was far from us.
Miamisburg operation.
Right, right. Well, we will pick up. Why don't we just pick up on our second part where you left off, showing that.
Okay.
And we just have. This has just been wonderful.
Well, we can keep going.
Oh, you have so much to share with us, and I'm just so pleased that you are here to do that.
Well, I'm pleased that the Historical Society has taken enough interest to try to preserve the history of Miamisburg. It's
yes.
a great thing.
Oh, yes. We're trying.